Hello learners and welcome to this class. Today we are going to study a poem called Pulley written by George Herbert. Now let us start off. The poem actually demonstrates the relationship between God and his creation of man. Here God is the Father and uses this pulley to pull man back to him and keep him good. The pulley demonstrates the life of a man and his evolution as a human being, his understanding of life, developing a pulley connection between himself and with God. George Herbert was a metaphysical poet. Before we get started with the poem, we must understand who metaphysical poets were. The metaphysical poets is a term coined by the poet critic called Samuel Johnson to explain about a loose group of British lyric poets of the 17th century. Their work was differentiated by the creative use of conceits and by guesswork about topics such as love or religion. These poets were not formally united. Most of them did not know about each other or did not read about each other either. Their approach was characterized by wit and metaphysical conceits. Unlikely or unusual similes or metaphors were used in their poems. For example, Andrew Marvell's comparison of the soul with a drop of dew. That is a metaphysical way of writing poetry. The precise definition of wit with which Johnson applied to the school was like this. He says, a kind of discordia concords, a combination of dissimilar images or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike, unquote. Their poetry deviated from the style of their times. That is, they wrote different poetry, including neither images of nature nor references to classical mythology were common in those days. Several metaphysical poets, especially John Donne, were influenced by Neoplatonism. One of the main Platonic concepts found in metaphysical poetry is the thought that the faultlessness of beauty in the beloved acted as a tribute to the perfect beauty in the eternal realm. Their work relies on images and references to the existing scientific or geographical discoveries. These were used to study religious and moral questions, often employing an element of theoretical reasoning used to resolve moral problems, often elusive or mysterious in nature, to define their understanding or personal relationship with God. Let us learn more about the poet who has written this great poem, Pulley. George Herbert was a Welsh-born English poet. He was born on April 3rd, 1593. He was an orator, an Anglican priest. His poetry is related with the writings of the metaphysical poets, and he is acknowledged as a central figure, extremely popular, extremely influential, and arguably the most dexterous and vital British devotional lyricist. He was born into a creative and wealthy family. Herbert received a good education that led to his holding important positions at Cambridge University and the Parliament. As a student at Trinity College, Cambridge, Herbert did extremely well in languages and music. He went to college with the purpose of becoming a priest, but his scholarship fascinated and got him the attention of King James. Herbert served in Parliament for 2 years. After the death of King James and at the advice of his friend, Herbert's interest in predestined ministry was re-established. In the year 1630, in his late 30s, he gave up his worldly ambitions and took holy orders in the Church of England, spending the rest of his life as a rector of the little parish of Fugglestone, St. Peter, with Bemerton, St. Andrew near Salisbury. He was noted for his abiding care for parishioners, bringing the sacraments to them when they were sick, providing food and clothing for the needy. Henry Vaughan has said of him, a most glorious saint and seer. Throughout his life, he wrote religious poems characterized by an accuracy of language, a metrical flexibility, and a clever use of imagery or conceits that was favored by the metaphysical poets of that time. Charles Cotton described him as a soul composed of harmonies. Herbert himself, in a letter to Nicholas Ferrar, said of his writings, "They are a picture of spiritual conflicts between God and my soul before I could subject my will to Jesus, my master." Some of Herbert's poems have endured as hymns, including King of Glory, King of Peace. His first biographer, Isaac Walton, described Herbert on his deathbed as composing such hymns and anthems as he and the angels now sing in heaven. Let us move on to the third module and read through the poem, Pulley. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessing standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made a stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure, rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, he said, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature, so both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. In the next module, Let us understand what this poem is all about. What is it that George Herbert is trying to tell us through his poem? I will explain this poem stanza-wise. In the first stanza, we understand that when God created man, God gave everything he had to proffer to man. He poured all his blessings on man. God blessed man and gave him all his riches because God felt that man was worthy of all these riches. God does this out of kindness of his heart and love for man. In the second stanza of the poem, Herbert says that God gave man everything he had to offer, such as strength, beauty, wisdom, honor, and pleasure. After God gave all these qualities, Herbert states that God stopped for a while. There was something that he held back at the bottom of the Pandora's box, which I will explain later. And that was rest, because God perceived that it was his greatest treasure. So he did not give rest to man. In the third stanza, God states that if he were to bestow the treasure of rest to man, then man would adore the gifts given by God instead of adoring him. Man would then rest in nature. Here, nature means his life. So, man would actually rest in his life instead of realizing his devotion to God who created nature. In the fourth stanza, God knew that riches given by him one day would result in spiritual agitation in man. That would also lead him to fatigue. Having got tired of his material gifts, man would unavoidably turn to God. God, being omniscient and prophetic, knew that ultimately mortal man would be prone to laziness or lassitude. His laziness would then be the pull that God would need to bring him back to him. In the perspective of the mechanical maneuver of a pulley, the kind of leverage the force applied makes the difference for the weight that is being lifted. Applied to man, in this poem, one can say that withholding rest from man, God will eventually act as a leverage that will hoist or draw mankind towards him. In the next module, we are going to study about the conceit present in this poem. It would be hard to explain Herbert's poem without alluding to Pandora's box of gifts. And that is exactly what I was talking about in the previous model. The gods, especially Zeus, gave Pandora a box, cautioning her never to open it. Her inquisitiveness overcame her, and she opened the box. The box released innumerable plagues and woes into the world. Only hope, the one fine thing that the box contained, remained to soothe humanity in its adversity or its difficulties. In this poem, the blending of the classical and Christian add richness and dimension to the poem's metaphysical conceit, which is a pulley that draws man to God. Pulleys and hoists are mechanical devices which assist us in moving heavy loads through a system of ropes and wheels to gain advantage. Herbert uses pulley as a central conceit from the area of physics and imagery, also from that discipline. This was a special feature the metaphysical poets had. In this poem, Pulley, the essential idea posed by Herbert is that when God made man, he emptied all his blessings on him, including vigor, magnificence, knowledge, nobility, happiness. However, he set aside rest. He did not give man rest, and that was kept in the bottom. God was conscious that if he were to confer this jewel, that is, if he were to give rest on man, then man would love God's gifts instead of God. God, therefore, withheld this gift of rest from man, knowing well that his other riches would one day result in agitation, spiritual fatigue, and man, having tried all the material gifts, would unavoidably one day turn to God. He knew that ultimately mortal man would be prone to lassitude, that is laziness, and then God would pull him back to himself. All God would then need is the pulley that would bring man to him. In the perspective of the mechanical maneuver of a pulley, the kind of leverage and force applied makes the difference for the weight that is being lifted. Applied to man in this poem, we can say that by withholding rest from man, God will eventually act as the leverage that will hoist or draw mankind to him. The significance of rest and sleep is an idea that primary in the minds of Renaissance writers. They had this in their thoughts when they were writing their works. Many of Shakespeare's plays include allusions to sleep or the lack of sleep as a penalty for sins, especially in his play Macbeth. For example, both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are besieged by the lack of sleep. Even Othello is most unsettled by the fact that he is unable to sleep peacefully once Iago has disillusioned him with the possibility of his wife's infidelity with Cassio. Herbert's pulley then does not present a new concept. In fact, the ideas in the poem are quite usual for the 17th century religious verse. What is noticeably metaphysical about the poem is that a religious notion is put across through a secular, scientific image that requires readers' association with an understanding of some basic laws of physics. In this poem, Pulley, Herbert uses mostly iambic meter. The first line and the last line in each stanza are 3 beats, that is 3 iambic feet. The rhyme of the poem is A B A B A. Let us conclude this poem. After reading this poem, the reader will come to understand that God is only seeking to make the best feasible life for all humans. He hopes that people will select the right path and act upon His will. For He has fashioned them, for He has nurtured them, for He has created them. If man does not opt for the right path, he will be surrounded by the Pandora's box, because Pandora's box consists of woes and maladies. Until he decides to change his temperament and worship God, man will never seek happiness. In this poem, Herbert is making a very emphatic point that God has created man and all humans make blunders. Therefore, God has created a symbolic pulley that reminds humans that they are still attached to Him, that they are still drawn to Him, that they are still a part of Him, but might need that additional pull to come back to worshiping to their true Creator, and their true Creator is God. In other words, the poem demonstrates a relationship between God and His creation man. Here God is the Father and uses pulley to pull back to Him and keep him good. He uses this pulley to bring mankind back to Him. He uses this pulley to make mankind realize that He is the Creator. He is the Father. He is the one to take care of them. The pulley demonstrates the life of man, his evolution as a human being, his understanding of life, and developing a pulley connection with God. So what do you understand from this poem? What is it that George Herbert is trying to tell us? He is trying to tell us that we are created by God. He is our Creator. He is our Father. He is there to love us, protect us, and guide us. We live in a world that is full of strife, that is full of problems. We have to face this life, and it is with the help of God, it is with His blessings that we sail through this perilous sea of life. Herbert is trying to tell us that every human being on this earth should have faith, should have love, should have that feeling of oneness with God, should feel that he is a part of that Creator. Herbert is trying to tell us that we should understand that as human beings, we have to show our love towards that God who has created us. Even if we diverge from our track, even if we move away from our track, God is always there to pull us back. He is always there to love us. He is always there to anchor us. He loves us, and that is something that we ultimately must realize. I hope you have enjoyed this poem as much as I have enjoyed teaching you. This poem has a lot of significance in our daily lives. We must have faith, and without faith, the world doesn't run. Faith is an important aspect in our life. Faith in God is very important, and we must realize that faith that we are born with. And God wants us to realize that faith. He actually is pulling us back to Him. He wants us to think of Him every time, because He is the one Creator who can give us a lot of confidence and make us feel happy. Thank you.